Okay, so I've been talking for about an hour now, hour and a half maybe, and I'm about done. I still haven't really gotten around to offering my alternative way of looking at these things. Basically, my timeline of history is that Moses lived, of course, in the 1500s and 1400s BC. The Israelites left Egypt in 1446 BC, and that was at the end of the Middle Kingdom period of Egyptian history, not during the New Kingdom period. I mentioned earlier about this list of dynasties and how these dynasties are there's 31 of them, I think, and we divide the periods of history up into the kingdom periods and the intermediate periods when they were not united as a whole kingdom. The conventional chronology as it exists today, and as it has existed for some time, is that the Exodus would overlap in time with the New Kingdom. The new the New Kingdom was the 18th through I think the 20th dynasties, I believe. The 18th dynasty is believed to have been in power in the 1400s BC, which is when the Exodus should have happened. There is absolutely no evidence in the 18th century records of anything even remotely like the Exodus happening, or even the conditions existing in the land being even remotely like uh, the conditions before the Exodus. At the time of the beginning of the 18th dynasty, the Egyptians had just regained their independence from occupation from foreign rulers, and they had kicked out all the foreigners of the land. They had not enslaved them and forced them to stay as slaves. Their capital was nowhere close to where the capital of Egypt was during the days of Moses. The capital of Egypt in Moses' days was in a place called Zoan or Tanis or whatever. The names change all the time, and that was in northern Egypt near the Delta, which is where the Israelites were. We know this because Moses frequently went back and forth from the Israelites to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh's palace was very close to where the Israelites were enslaved. And the palaces of the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty were not in that region. They were down south, low in the upper Egypt region in the south, in Cairo and Memphis, not within easy traveling distance of the Israelite territory to the north where the Israelites were enslaved. And so Moses could not have gone back and forth on a regular basis between the palace and between the Israelite people. Um, the data simply doesn't match at all. The pharaohs of the 18th century were long-lived and very powerful. Like I said earlier, they had vested interests in foreign affairs. They frequently conducted raids into foreign nations, into the Asiatic nations of the East, which is where the Israelites came from and went back to. And that would not have been possible after the Exodus, after the falling of the army in the Red Sea. So there is no data whatsoever from the 18th dynasty that supports any of the data from the Exodus period as recorded in the Exodus. Same thing goes to the 19th, and the 18th dynasty we have dated in the 1400s BC. Same thing with the 19th dynasty. Some of the, like I said earlier, Ramesses, the king Ramesses, was a 19th dynasty king. The guy I said was Ramesses the Great. That was a 19th dynasty name. And people look at the name Ramesses as mentioned in Exodus, the store city of Ramesses, and they believe that the Pharaoh Ramesses forced the Israelites to build a city that he had named after himself. So then we put the time of the Exodus into the 19th dynasty, which we say is in the 1200s BC. So and again, that goes back to what I mentioned in the previous video of altering the meaning of 1 Kings 6:1, where it talks about the 480 years before Solomon's fourth year when he started building the temple, being the year of the Exodus. So obviously the 1200s BC is not 480 years removed from Solomon's time, or his fourth year to be specific. So then we have to take that First Kings text and say, well, it doesn't really mean 480 years. That's why we have to do that. Because we want to put the Exodus in the time of Ramesses to match it up with the city named Ramesses in Exodus. And that, we believe, was in the 1200s BC. So then we have to change First Kings around and say that means something else too. But you see, none of these conclusions are right. None of everything that we're doing here, Like every conclusion we've reached is wrong. So every action we have to take then to support this conclusion is wrong. The pharaohs, the name of the city when the Israelites built it was not Ramesses. That Pharaoh Ramesses was not the pharaoh who forced them to build that city. Pharaoh the Great didn't live in the 1200s. Period. So the Exodus didn't happen in the 1200s BC. 1 Kings 6:1 does mean an actual 480 years, and matches up with other biblical data. They say that Jephthah lived about 300 years. During the time of Jephthah, which is a judge, we'll get to the judges later, they had been in the land for about 300 years, and that was about 100 years before Saul came along. So all this data that we get, none of it matches our conclusion of Ramesses being the Pharaoh of the Exodus, or the oppression at least, in the days of Moses and so forth. Like, none of that is right. Like, every bit of that is wrong. Every part of that conclusion is wrong. And because it's wrong, we refuse to accept that it's wrong or acknowledge that it's wrong because we've taken our reputations on it. We have to then say all these other things about all these. We have to explain away all these other pieces of data and say, well, that doesn't really mean that. Here's how to fit our preferred interpretation, rather than letting the data itself inform us about, okay, 1 Kings 6:1 means literally 480 years. Right? Moses was in fact born in 1526 BC according to our universal time scale. The Exodus happened in 1446 BC, so we should be looking for data that matches that in 1446 BC, not in the 1200s BC, not when we think Ramses the Great was Pharaoh. And instead of letting the data actually inform us of what happened, we come up with a scenario of what we think must have happened and then force the data to fit that scenario. So all of that is wrong. So the 19th dynasty, which Ramesses was a member of, was also not the time period of again, the same thing. The 19th dynasty was a dynasty of expansionism and imperialism and foreign affairs. Ramesses himself was a long-lived pharaoh, far too powerful and far too long-lived to be the pharaoh of the Exodus, certainly, and probably the oppression too. We even have Pharaoh Ramesses' body, but Ramesses the Great is one of the pharaohs whose mummy we found. It was hidden in some extra archive, not in his own pyramid. But we found it. We have it. Okay, if the Pharaoh of the Exodus died in the Red Sea, we're not going to have his body. It should be a pharaoh that we don't have the mummy for. Maybe not even a pyramid of. He may not even have time to build a pyramid for himself or any other kind of tomb. So none of this fits. Like none of the data of Ramesses the Great fits the time period of the Exodus. So the Exodus didn't happen during the time of the 18th dynasty or the 19th dynasty, or even during the time of the New Kingdom period. Again, remember those kingdom periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, and those intermediate periods in between them. And the New Kingdom is the 18th, 19th, and maybe 20th dynasties. I'm not really sure exactly how far it goes. And that's often when we can, and because we have the chronology of Egypt written in such a way, we consider the New Kingdom period to be in the 15, 14, 13, 1200s BC, 18, 19 dynasties. But again, that's inaccurate. That's wrong. We have not assigned the data correctly after the New Kingdom period, so we have stretched out. I mentioned earlier about these dynasties. We have assumed more than we should have about some of these dynasties being successive, one after the other, after the other, after the other, without periods of overlap or concurrency, which if there were any such periods of overlap or concurrency, that would shorten the timeline considerably. I'm not really qualified necessarily to get into the data about that, and that's getting kind of beyond the scope of this video series anyway. But I am persuaded by what I have read from qualified people that there is more than sufficient reason to question whether we have the dates of the New Kingdom and the periods following after that correct, and whether Egyptian history should actually be shortened by several hundred years, because some of these dynasties that we think were successive, one after the other, were actually, at least to some degree, concurrent, thus shortening the time period of that stretch of time by a century or more here or there. a significant difference. That does make a significant difference. When your time is off by 100 years here or 100 years there, that makes a difference. That makes a significant difference, or more. You know. So my argument is that the time period, our timeline for Egyptian history is off, and we should move the New Kingdom period back later in history, and move the Middle Kingdom period back later in history, and have the Middle Kingdom assign the Middle Kingdom the period of time in which the Israelites were actually in Egypt, because that's where we find the data for Asiatics in Egypt. That's where we find the house where Joseph and his family probably lived, even Joseph's own little mini pyramid tomb, and probably a statue depicting him. That's where we find evidence of the circumstances in Egypt being similar to what Genesis describes in the days of Joseph's time there. For example, Amenemhat the First, an early pharaoh of the 12th dynasty. The Middle Kingdom period is the 11th and 12th dynasties, and we're talking primarily here about the 12th dynasty. I believe, it is my contention, that the entire portion of Israelite history that they spent in Egypt can be fitted into the 12th dynasty, maybe trailing off a little bit into the 13th dynasty at the very end. But that is basically the Middle Kingdom period. When the Middle Kingdom fell, when the 12th dynasty fell, Egypt was then conquered by foreign rulers, and that's where we had the second intermediate period, and was ruled by foreign rulers, several different dynasties actually, for a while. I believe that happened after the Israelites left. In fact, I believe the Bible even kind of shows us the identity of those people who conquered Egypt, although it doesn't specifically name them, as the Amalekites, whom the Israelites actually met on their way out of Egypt and fought. I believe either that was an advanced unit coming down to scout the land, or they just happened to be there, I'm not sure. But I believe that after the Israelites left Egypt and fought the Amalekites on their way out, the Amalekites moved in and conquered and occupied Egypt, at least portions of Egypt, because Egypt had several different dynasties. The 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th dynasties, at least to some degree, overlapped with each other. And some of those, at least, were foreign-born rulers, the Hyksos. The word Hyksos essentially just means shepherd kings. And they were outsiders who conquered Egypt and ruled at least parts of Egypt for a period of time. And I believe they were the Amalekites. I believe they came into Egypt after the Israelites left. Egypt was totally defenseless. It had no army. The army had been destroyed in the Red Sea. The Hyksos took over, basically ruled Egypt, and made them slaves like the Egyptians had made Israelite slaves for a period of a couple of hundred years. And I think that equates then to the time period of the Judges, when Israel was in the land, but was not being harassed by Egypt. Israel had problems while they were in the land. They were being harassed by people in the land that they didn't get rid of when they first moved in. But the Egyptians were not part of the problem. We don't read about the Egyptians in the book of Judges. They're conspicuously absent. I believe the reason why is because the Egyptians themselves were having their own problems at that time, or were being, at that time, conquered and oppressed by the foreign rulers they called the Hyksos. Eventually, the Egyptians got their act together, kicked the Hyksos out of Egypt. I think that would have happened right around the time Israel was transforming into a monarchy, because Saul actually fights the Amalekites at the beginning of Israel's monarchy. He, in fact, is supposed to kill them. One of the reasons why Saul and God have a falling out is that he doesn't follow God's instructions properly about totally wiping the Amalekites out, along with all their stuff and all their animals. And so he basically fights the Amalekites, I think, as they're being forced out of Egypt back into Canaan. And this would be in the 1000s BC, basically. And that would be essentially the beginning of the New Kingdom period. So the New Kingdom then would be concurrent with Israel's monarchy. David and Solomon, the united kings of Israel, would have been contemporary with, for example, the 18th and 19th dynasties, which we typically associate happening 400 or 500 years before that. So to me, all of these conclusions that we have reached about these things, all of them are wrong. We're wrong about the identity of Ramesses, the store city, being named after Ramesses the emperor, the pharaoh. We're wrong about the time period in which that particular Ramesses lived. We're wrong about the time period in which the Exodus happened. Like, we're wrong about the way to interpret 1 Kings 6:1. Like, all these things, all these conclusions we've reached are wrong. And we've reached these conclusions based on our desire to connect the city of Ramesses in Exodus with the Pharaoh Ramesses that we find references to all throughout Egyptian history. And that goes back to our initial efforts to uncover evidence for the Bible's events in Egypt. We made this connection between the Pharaoh Ramesses and the city of Ramesses, and that was back in the 1800s, and we've never corrected that assumption. And so because of that, we've constructed partially part of this, our construct of Egyptian history is built on this, at least partially on this conclusion of Pharaoh Ramesses being equivalent to the city Ramesses, and that's not accurate. So all of our conclusions then about when all these things happened end up being wrong. So my overview of what I believe is accurate, the actual accurate sequence of events, is that I believe Abraham went down to Egypt in his own time. I believe he was there during the days of the Old Kingdom. I believe that he came from the Babylonian area, Ur of the Chaldeans. I believe during the time he was there, he shared with them some of his advanced understanding of mathematics and science that they had in Babylonia that didn't necessarily have in Egypt. I believe this then motivated the Egyptians to go on their pyramid building quest. The one thing that we often forget is that those huge pyramids the Egyptians built are really, really old. And that goes back all the way to the Old Kingdom, the early dynasties. And the very first ones they built were not as good as the wave that came after. And I believe that they improved their pyramid building technique with some of the mathematical understanding that Abraham may have shared with them from his advanced land of Ur of the Chaldeans when he was there in Egypt, as recorded in Genesis 12 or 13. 12, I think. Early in the story of Abraham. It's one of the first things he did, actually. And I believe that was in the Old Kingdom period. I personally believe the Old Kingdom fell apart largely because building these pyramids took such a toll on them that their economy essentially, they didn't employ, as far as we know, they didn't actually employ slave labor to build those pyramids. We might think that they did. It's often assumed that they did. Maybe later pharaohs did, but as far as we can tell, those really huge pyramids, those 3 or 4 really huge ones that go back all the way to near the beginning, as far as we can tell, they didn't actually employ slave labor to build those. So I believe that in the process of building those huge pyramids, they collapsed their economy, which was the end of the Old Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom is in power when Joseph gets there. In fact, I believe you even have indirect evidence of this in some of the Middle Kingdom's writings. One of the early pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom was a guy named Amenemhat I. And in all of the the Middle Kingdom, the 12th dynasty, I should say, the 12th dynasty, which I believe is the dynasty that was in control during the Israelites' time in Egypt, all of the 12th dynasty pharaohs, it ended actually with the lady pharaoh, the first lady pharaoh of Egypt. And I believe that from what I understand, off the top of my head, I believe all the pharaohs of the 12th dynasty are either named Amenemhat or Senusret. 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. And Amenemhat I was the beginning of the line of the 12th dynasty, and he apparently was attacked by his own bodyguard one night when he had lain down to sleep. There's even a record of this in his own. It's hard to say whether or not he wrote this. It's a little unclear whether he actually survived the attack or not. It's hard to say. But he apparently was attacked by members of his own bodyguard, and even indicates that one of the people behind the attack was the guy who put food in his mouth, i.e. possibly the baker. So that could even be a connection with the baker and the cupbearer in the prison of Joseph, the time that Joseph is in prison. If they were suspected of being part of this palace coup, and the baker ended up actually being a part of the palace coup, it then explains why he gets executed and the cupbearer does not, or why they're both in prison in the first place. So I believe that is the time period in which Joseph enters Egypt, and I believe the Israelites themselves their entire time frame in Egypt fits within the 12th dynasty, not the 18th or the 19th. I believe now again, remember, something else to keep in mind is that the Israelites were not in Egypt as long as we often believe they were. We read in Exodus 12:40 about the Israelites, in some translations, about the Israelites' time in Egypt being 430 years, but that's actually probably not the correct translation of that verse. Their entire time, from the time God spoke to Abraham in Genesis 15 to their arrival at Sinai and the giving the law, was 430 years. Paul clarifies that in Galatians. And so that includes the rest of the time of Abraham's sojourn in Canaan, as well as Isaac's and Jacob's, up until the time they go down to Egypt. So that 430 years is not all their time in Egypt. They're only in Egypt about half that time. And again, that makes a difference. When you cut down the time of them being in Egypt from 430 years to 210 years or so, that makes a difference to the timeline. That's a big difference. That's 210 additional years we don't need to find for them to be in Egypt, because they're not there during that time. Or 220 years, actually. Because anyway, they're basically there for half the time. That 430-year period is basically split up. Half the time they're still in Canaan, half the time they're in Egypt. They're not in Egypt the full 400 plus years. Although we often assume that. And that again messes up our timeline. So then they're in the Egypt for 200 or so years, and their entire time in Egypt then fits within the 12th dynasty, maybe tailing off into the beginning of the 13th dynasty at the very, very end there. I'm not really clear. I believe when they left Egypt, when the plagues happened, when Egypt was destroyed, essentially ruined economically and socially, and militarily, because the army was perished in the Red Sea pursuing the Israelites, or the Sea of Reeds. I believe it was after that Egypt was totally left defenseless, and they were conquered. As the Israelites went out, the Amalekites came in, conquered Egypt, and ruled Egypt for the next few hundred years, basically during the period of the Judges. And then the Egyptians band together, kick them out. They basically finally get defeated once and for all by the Israelites after they go back to the land of Israel, or Canaan, around 1000 BC or so, and it's around that time that the new kingdom in Israel forms. And then we start seeing Egypt mentioned in contact with Israel again. During the period of the Judges, we don't hear a thing about Egypt. We have no idea what's going on in Egypt during that time, which does not stand true for the periods of time when Egypt was independent and able to make excursions to other nations. It stands to reason that we're not hearing about them, and the Israelites themselves weren't in good shape during this time. So it stands to reason then, the reason why we don't hear about Egypt coming into the land and trying to take control of that area is because Egypt itself was not in a position to do that during that time, because they themselves were under control by a foreign power. But then, when David and Solomon come along, we do start seeing Egypt mentioned again. In fact, Solomon gets a bride from Egypt. And in fact, this is even further evidence that Egypt had still not totally gotten its act together, because they send their daughter, their princess, to go live with Solomon, which they typically didn't do. Egypt was too proud to send its princesses to live with other kings, so the fact that Solomon is taking a princess and having her live with him in Jerusalem itself is indication that at that time he is the stronger partner in the stronger half of the partnership. And then we hear about the king of Egypt rampaging Jerusalem and plundering the treasures after Solomon in the days of Rehoboam, 5 years after Solomon's death. So then we start seeing Egypt portrayed as a power again. That's in 925 BC. Okay, so I believe it's at that time when Egypt's new kingdom kicks in, and they're finally able to take excursions into other lands again, which is totally off what we normally consider as being the time frame of the new kingdom. Now again, I don't pretend to have the end-all be-all answers to this. I just look at the data and I say this makes sense to me. If this doesn't make sense to you, or if you take a hot exception to this, by all means, feel free to go ahead. Feel free to, again, I don't have access to anything that anybody listening to me doesn't have access to. But this is where I believe Egyptian and Israelite history intersect. So as I begin going into Exodus, we can think of ourselves in a Middle Kingdom context of Egypt in the 12th dynasty, with the Pharaoh, and the names of the pharaohs would basically be alternating between Amenemhat and Senusret. Amenemhat the first His son was Senusret the first, and then I don't know, and then we have Senusret the second and third, and Amenemhat the second and third, and then there's an Amenemhat the fourth. Some people think Amenemhat the fourth was actually the Pharaoh of the Exodus itself. Some people think Amenemhat the fourth was actually Moses, his Pharaoh name, before he abandoned his position as the Prince of Egypt. But it was during that time, and then after, and then the 12th dynasty actually ended with the first female pharaoh taking over. Not Hatshepsut, she was one of the later ones. I forget. Actually, I'm not sure. I'll forget what the name of the female pharaoh at the end of the 12th dynasty was. I'll check it and mention it again when we get there. But basically, Joseph would have been around the time of Senusret the first, or sometime in that time frame. And then it was during the 12th dynasty of Egypt, with the Amenemhats and the Sesostris pharaohs alternating back and forth, that the Israelites were there and left. And when they left, I think that Egypt was weakened enough that they were invaded by foreign rulers, suffered under foreign occupation for a number of years, generations, and then finally kicked them out and became the new kingdom again around the time that Israel's monarchy got started. And that, to me, is the broad scope of how Egyptian and Israelite history intersect. So when people say that there's no evidence of the Israelites being in Egypt, that's not accurate. There is evidence. There are grave pits, there are houses, there are Asiatic slave lists of those kinds of people being with Asiatic names, with those kinds of people being in Egypt, but just not during the time frame that we have made in our construct of Egyptian history. We see these things happening at a later point in time, and think that has to be wrong then, because we think our timeline has to be right. When they go into the land and conquer the cities, the cities themselves were conquered. They were just, no one's doubting that. Well, the question is, when did that happen, and when were the Israelites there? So the evidence is the same. The evidence is there, and it's visible. It can be seen. It can be looked at, analyzed. But because we stick to a concept of history that I believe is wrong and off by several centuries, we're putting this evidence in the wrong place on the timeline, and so we're completely missing where the actual synchronisms happen. So therefore, we construct a history that cannot coexist, has to be in conflict, cannot coexist with the Bible's history. And since we believe our history is better, it's our history, it's what we put together, so we assume is correct. Therefore, the Bible has to be wrong, but that's doing a disservice to everything. It's doing a disservice to the Bible, it's doing a disservice to actual history, and it's putting us on a pedestal saying that we now know the history better than the ancient people themselves did, which I think is a very arrogant and obnoxious attitude to have, but fits perfectly in line with how we normally behave, so not to be surprised at all. These are, again, I don't have an actual lesson plan or a study guide to follow. I'm just kind of like talking, basically. I am going to go ahead and go over these again before I post them, and maybe I'll add more later if I think I left anything out or whatever. I really don't know. For the most part, though, when I'm going to be doing it like I usually do it, whereas when I read through the Old Testament and I find a point of contact or synchronism with, an important one at least, with extra, world history at that time, I will mention it. As far as giving a big info dump before we move on, I'm pretty much done with that.